Have you ever looked back at an analysis you did in the past and see how just flat out wrong you were? And have you ever admitted to being wrong? Well, I'm about to do both, as embarrassing as it may be. Just over a year ago, I made a video declaring how wrong John McWhorter was about Jordan Peterson. In that video, which I'm going to review in this video, I accused John McWhorter of engaging with Peterson in bad faith. But as I've come to understand, I was wrong and John McWhorter was right all along. It all started when John McWhorter attended one of Peterson's events at Aspen. During the event, Peterson claimed to have a technique based on his training as a psychologist that enables him to be able to tell when a pronoun person is being disingenuous with their gender identity. John picked up on that and wanted Peterson to explain that technique he claimed to have based on his training as a psychologist.
Professor Peterson, I teach students. I teach trans students, and I'm asked often to call people singularly they. It started probably about 4 years ago. It struck me as very odd. I'm 52. And some of them, you can tell that it's coming from a very deep place, and that's how they feel, and they deeply need to be called they. Some of them, my horse sense says that they're kind of enjoying giving me a certain shock, and that there's a certain theatrical aspect. It's my horse sense that there's a certain épate la bourgeois aspect to it. I kind of feel it, and I'm probably right. But I can't know. I'm a linguist, I'm a person, and my general feeling has been, whatever they ask, just go with it, and let's change our usage of the pronouns, because we have a lot to do. Now, what you said was interesting. You said that the way that you make the difference in deciding these cases is based on the fact that you have psychological training and you can tell. What I want to know is, for my own elucidation, and also because I think many of us wondered, but then it kind of went by, how do you know? I want to know specifically, because I'm a linguist, you have psychological training. How would you know? Based on your training, which is immense, how would you know which students to discount as opposed to which ones to go along with?
Sometime later, John brought up the exchange in his conversation with Glenn Lowry, referring to Peterson as being sinister and appealing to fanboys. And being the Peterson fanboy that I was at that time, I jumped to Peterson's defense. So today I want to react to John McWhorter's critique of Jordan Peterson. See, John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry are two of my favorite public intellectuals, and for the most part they're right, and I agree with them. But in this regard, I disagree with John McWhorter's criticism of Jordan Peterson.
People in general are not fools. I think that more and more it's that they've been instructed in maybe 2 or 3 basic tenets which fall apart if you actually examine them. And I think that's a lot of the whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon, that he is teaching a certain kind of mostly fanboy to think for themselves. And yeah, he's kind of sinister. And I had a little encounter with him at Aspen. I was one of many people in the audience, and Corby Kummer, the Atlantic writer, we were sitting together, and he got me the microphone because I was saying to him, this guy needs to be asked a real question.
Yes, Jordan Peterson is sinister, and I was blissfully unaware of that. Because this was before I was exposed to his toxic persona on Twitter. I saw his self-help videos on personal responsibility, his takedown of woke ideology, and his championing of conservative ideals, and thought that was all it was to this man.
Just try not to do things you know to be stupid and wrong for a month. And that means not to say things you know to be stupid and wrong as well. Maybe that's the most important thing. Just do it as an experiment. See what happens. And it's so fun because I have people writing to me from all over the world who are saying they're doing that. They're saying, well, you know, I cleaned up my room and then I stopped saying stupid things. And my God, it's like things are way better. It's like, who would have guessed it?
I saw him as a modern day philosopher, an important thinker who was only concerned with pointing out the obvious without an agenda. But even then, something about him rubbed me the wrong way. Something about Peterson alarmed me even when I was still his fan. I just couldn't put words to it. His Twitter engagement provided the missing piece of the puzzle that finally opened my eyes to the real Peterson. Peterson has proven himself to be a sinister figure, with his childish, almost insane rants on Twitter, attacking a model on Sports Illustrated magazine, daring people to call him sis to his face to see what happens, his serial strawmanning of opponents' arguments, and complicating simple issues, never answering a yes or no question without going off on a 15-minute rant about lobsters and Carl Jung, crying at odd intervals, and so much more fun stuff, like this weird tweet about sex. Back to the video, John had sensed that nobody was going to ask Peterson a serious question, since at that point he had attained celebrity status, and his audience was simply lapping up what was coming out of his mouth as though he was a literal prophet. Well, he stopped short of calling himself a prophet one time.
Just getting back onto this issue of you sort of almost being a prophet in a way, do you view yourself as that? I mean, as religion declines, you go on this world tour, millions of people read your books, billions of people probably watching the videos online. Do you see yourself as a sort of new religious phenomenon for people?
Not new. Not new. And I see myself as fortunate. That's how I see myself, that I have the opportunity to do this.
But are you a prophet?
And, see, to say yes or no, I have to think about how I might be conceptualized, how what I'm doing might be conceptualized. No, I think I see myself as a psychologist, and fundamentally, I am a psychologist. I'm a behavioral psychologist.
Wow, it took him that long to answer a question on whether or not he sees himself as a prophet. Now, back to the exchange. Most of the questions were likely going to be softball questions, or questions that Peterson could simply dismiss by referring to the person as a postmodernist neo-Marxist type. John wasn't having any of this, and I took issues with John's framing of his need to ask a real question.
I was one of many people in the audience, and Corby Kummer, the Atlantic writer, we were sitting together, and he got me the microphone because I was saying to him, this guy needs to be asked a real question.
And that's a bit condescending to the people who asked Jordan Peterson a question on that day. So of all the people that asked him a question, nobody asked him a real question, and the responsibility had to fall on you to ask him a real question.
As will be revealed later, Peterson had no such technique, and he tried to weasel his way out of that by trying to reframe the question, which is what Peterson does all the time. I noticed that Peterson is often very vague in speech, laden with so many caveats like line mines, which I suspect is him laying signposts for his retreat to a safe space of, that's not what I meant. If his words are so vague, then he can claim any convenient interpretation and dismiss the interpretations which he had intended but was called out on.
How would you know which students to discount as opposed to which ones to go along with?
Okay, well, first of all, I wouldn't know, which is partly why your skepticism is justified. But I have to be responsible for what I say based on my willingness to take responsibility for my judgment. So I would be willing to do that despite the fact that I might be wrong. But having said that, in any reasonable situation, I would err on the side of addressing the person in the manner that they requested to be addressed. So that's the end of the game as far as I'm concerned. So, because there is no excuse for compelling it by law. That's my position, and I think there's all sorts of reasons for that. I don't think it was an isolated legislative move. I think it's part and parcel of a whole sequence of legislative moves that have been made and that continue to be made in Canada. I think it's an attempt by a certain radical ideological, a certain radical ideology to gain the linguistic upper hand, which I think is a terrible thing to do, to allow. So I had lots of reasons for rejecting the legislation. But it had nothing to do with it.
About how your psychological training would make the difference. That's very interesting. We're talking about expertise here, and my ears pricked up when you talked about how there is a way of thinking that would allow us to decide.
John is right here. Peterson tried to reframe the question to being about compelled speech, and he stands against it when John's question wasn't about that. John's question was about his claim that he had a technique to know which pronoun person was being sincere or not. Now, this is a famous trick that Peterson often pulls off successfully. You ask him a question, he goes off on a tangent that by the end of his answer, he's brought in so many loosely connected points that do not directly address your question, which ends up seeming like he's giving a substantive answer. Something which anyone under the Peterson spell will fail to see. And it's shocking to see how unprepared Peterson was for such a question. As John pointed out, he was used to blowing smoke up people's asses and getting away with it.
Everybody's caught up in the fact that technically he's saying he will not follow a law to the effect that he has to use pronouns like this. Now, if you're a legal scholar, etc., I suppose that's interesting, but that's not what I asked the man. Right. And he tried to talk about that, and I kept trying to hold his feet to the fire. How can you tell? And he didn't give an answer, which surprised me because I thought he would be prepared to give a real answer. You get the feeling that he's used to basically saying the same 12 or 13 things over and over. He could have given a better answer.
One of the things I noticed about John is that at times he gets too nuanced for his own good. I mean, it's good to be nuanced because I actually like it when he's nuanced in his conversations with Glenn Lowry, because he sort of brings some balance to the conversation. He makes it much more center and much more balanced and centrist. But at times he gets too nuanced for his own good, and I think this is one of the situations in which John himself gets too nuanced for his own good.
So here is me again defending Peterson and discounting John's admirable quality of being nuanced. But that was because I was almost a right-wing nut who did not yet appreciate the value of nuance in assessing complex situations. I was using common sense, which can often lead one astray when discussing complex issues. For this, I apologize. I do know better now. Cutting back to Jordan's first response to John's question, Peterson says he wouldn't know. That seemed odd, as he had earlier stated during the lecture that he could tell based on his psychological training who was faking their gender identity. So, which is it? Did he lie earlier or is he lying now? Because those are two contradicting claims on the same point. My money is on he was lying then and being truthful now, sensing that the gig was up. I was frankly surprised that Peterson very early retreated into his safe space of "that's not what I meant." Usually he'd go on a several minutes rant before doing that, but I suspect he knew McWhorter wasn't the typical opposition he was used to dealing with. See, Peterson is a very smart man, as he knows how to cover his bases, which makes me believe that he's being disingenuous on purpose. If people don't pick up on his deceit, he goes on with it. If they do, he's laid so many ways to retreat to a safe space and claim he was being misinterpreted.
That answer makes sense to me. You understand? And he has said that he would err in the direction of actually addressing the people in the manner in which they want to be addressed, even if he did know, even if he suspected that they were lying, they were not being honest in their gender representations. He just admitted, just as John had said, that well, he would have similar feelings, but he would go ahead to call them the gender pronouns which they themselves wanted to be called. It's the same thing Jordan is saying here, that even though he suspects that some of these people are not being genuine with their gender pronouns, he would go ahead to call them that.
I totally missed the point here. The point isn't whether Jordan Peterson suspected that the students were being genuine in their gender identity, which was what Peterson just answered. The question was about him knowing based on his psychological training. Those are two different questions. Peterson, like always, seemed to be answering a question that no one asked. Charles, your past self kept missing the point. The question wasn't about whether he'd respect people's pronouns. It was about how he knew when people were faking their gender identity versus when they were being genuine. What a dummy I was back then. Peterson in his rant kept pulling a bait and switch. He moved the question from "how do you know" to the attempts by ideologues to capture language, which is true and I agree with. See, by answering a question which is true and that everybody agrees with, Jordan is able to fool people into thinking he has given the correct answer to the question, not knowing that he has quickly taken us away from the original question to another one. But McWhorter is unrelenting. Here, McWhorter reiterates his question, and Peterson tries but fails to reframe the question for the 100th time and even revises his answer in the process.
That's very interesting. We're talking about expertise here, and my ears pricked up when you talked about how there is a way of thinking that would allow us to decide. I know some of my
there's a way of
students-
thinking that would allow me to decide for me.
No, us to decide for us. Surely you have a larger...
John, it's as if John is he's looking for a very, very specific answer he knows that Jordan Peterson is not going to be able to provide, yet he insists on having that answer because Jordan is saying, okay, there is a certain technique that will allow me to decide. He was the one who made the statement in the first place, and if he was wrong in his statement, he's correcting it now. But John is just obstinate, and he's rephrasing and saying, no, you said there was a certain technique that we can use to decide. But the person who said that statement in the first place is telling you that what I actually meant was that there is a technique that I can use to decide. So why are you being obstinate about this?
God, I can't stand my old self. So here I was saying Peterson was the one who made the statement and he was wrong in the statement. He was correcting himself now. It totally flew past my head that Peterson never admitted to being wrong in his initial answer. So why wasn't I able to see this then? This was because I was captured and enamored by the man Peterson, that I would literally make up a defense for him that didn't make sense.
No, I had a perfectly straightforward mission, which was there's no damn way I was going to say those words when I was compelled to by law. That was my mission.
You weren't trying to model for the rest of us a way of thinking. It was really only about you?
No, well, it was about me and the law. I thought the lawmakers had gone too far. They'd stepped out of their appropriate territory into the domain of linguistic freedom. And as far as I was concerned, I was going to put up with that. And so if people were happy about that and wanted to follow the example, well, that was fine with them. But for me, it was something, and that was the statement. I'm not doing this. And then if people can draw their own conclusions from that, maybe they want to do it. I mean, and I've spoken with no shortage of trans people, and, you know, my proclivity has been without exception so far to address them in the manner that seems most socially appropriate under the circumstances. Now, you asked a specific question, which was, do I have special expertise that I might share with other people?
You're doing Martin Luther, and I think that these issues are a little subtler than those. And so,
well, what makes you think that you're doing the kids that are grandstanding any favors by going along with their manipulation?
Because I can't decide which ones those are.
Well,
I just have my gut instincts, and that's not good enough.
Look, fair enough.
At this point, Peterson was just going on and on about the wrong question.
I have one more thing to say, because
Sure.
I'm not going to take up any more space.
Okay.
Are you saying that psychological theory has nothing to teach us about this? Because you're talking around my question. You're gorgeously articulate. You're smarter than me. Does psychology have anything to teach us or not? Yes or no?
Oh, that was a slam dunk by John. John picked up that Jordan Peterson was dancing around this question, talking so much in a bid to throw John off. John goes in one last time for the kill and asks a yes or no question. Is there a technique in psychology that people can learn that will enable them to be able to tell who was faking their gender identity? Yes or no? And as per usual, Jordan Peterson refuses to answer a yes or no question. It's like he lacks the capacity or the ability to give a yes or no answer.
I don't think that it has anything to teach. I don't think it has anything to offer that I could teach you without. Let me think.
So it's just too complicated?
No, it's not. No, it's not that. Well, it is that in part because it's not easy to articulate out the principles, the unerring principles by which you would make such a categorical judgment, right? Because those are very situation-specific problems, you know, and it's part of the problem of how to make a generic moral truth applied to a very individualistic situation. And the problem in the sorts of situations that you're describing is generally the devil's in the details, right? You have all these students, the ones that you just laid out, they vary in their attitude towards their self-professed gender from the ones who are grandstanding to some degree, let's say, to the ones that are very serious. And you have to make a judgment in the moment that is dependent on the variables that present themselves in a very complex way in that situation. And I understand why you took the pathway that you took, and it's perfectly reasonable to do so. My point was that you don't minimize all the errors by doing so. It's fine. It's still a fine way of approaching. It isn't. My point was that because of my psychological acumen, I would say that the experience that I've derived is that I would be comfortable in making the judgment and taking the consequential risk. I'm not saying I'd be correct. That's not the same thing at all. I'm willing to suffer the consequences of my error. That's not the same thing as being right. And so if I feel that a student is manipulating me, then I'm not going to go along with it. Now, I might be wrong about that and actually hurt someone who's genuinely asking for something that they need. But I'm also, what would you say, sensitive to the error of allowing manipulation to go unchecked.
And now, see, I think Jordan Peterson has answered all the questions that needed to be answered in this case. I think he has explained to you that he doesn't have any particular technique. And he's also explained to you that if there are any principles at all in discerning whether someone is lying or not, it has to be very, very situationally specific. You have to be in that moment to be able to make that call to say, okay, and taking so many variables into account to say, okay, is this person actually being truthful, or is this person just messing with me? Is this person genuine in their need for wanting to be called in this an unorthodox manner, or is this person just joking or playing around with me? And he says that based on his psychological training that he can make a reasonable guess, and not that because he's making that guess that he's going to be 100% right. He's allowing for the possibility that he might be wrong, but also that he's allowing for the possibility that he's also allowing that he will take responsibilities for his error, that he's ready to suffer the consequences of him being wrong. So I don't see any reason why John thinks that he hasn't answered this question, because if flat out told you that no, that he didn't have any such technique, and if I thought there was such a technique, it's not something that can be laid out and be used generically in all cases because situations differ. But John is still insistent.
And here I go with the standard Peterson fanboy defense that John simply had an agenda against Peterson and that his question was in bad faith. The truth is, John was right and I was an idiot back then. What my evolution reveals to me is that well meaning people, and I dare say smart people like myself, can be fooled or deceived. They can be enchanted by the spell of a fast talking, charismatic charlatan, and that it takes a conscious effort at being critical to be able to ensure that you're not being fooled by a snake oil salesman like Jordan Peterson.